Welcome to another episode of Systems Philosophy. I want to follow on from the concepts we've been building over the last 3 episodes, starting from the separation of the material from the form and seeing through the ship of Theseus example that the persistence of a form can be as much an object as the persistence of the matter that makes up that form. We then started bringing in that form being dynamically maintained, either externally through human maintenance against the natural degradation, or intrinsically by living systems using single cells as a fundamental conceptual tool. We looked at how the single cell can replace basically all the matter within its structure and still persist. We contemplated if we change our perspective that the cell division destroys the original cell to the perspective that the cell division divides the original cell, much like lighting a second candle off a first divides the flame and doesn't destroy the original flame. We have the perspective that all the living cells around us are still that original living cell, which for me personally is a dramatic paradigm shift from life and death to eternal life, at least at the single cellular level. I then covered the fact that these cells, as they're maintained over time, can be considered a system in stable dynamic equilibrium, where we have the forces of degradation competing with the forces of repair, or equilibrium versus disequilibrium, if you want to talk more technically. And we have the cell dies when the repair processes can't return the cell to equilibrium, be that the original equilibrium or a drift of equilibrium over time. That was another concept that I followed. That equilibrium itself is not some static blueprint that the cell returns to. It simply needs to do what evolution demands, which is survive and reproduce. And so the single cell lineage that we imagine as the first proto-cell has evolved and diversified into all the forms of life on Earth today. At least that's the current theory of evolution. From there, we expanded the boundary, so the cell is bounded by a wall, and the wall encapsulates the interior of the cell and separates it from the exterior. So we get an abstraction or a modularized component, which is why we see the cell separate from the environment. That separation is real in terms of structure, but it's also abstractly chosen because the cell is never separate from its environment. And therefore, the environment and the cell are always interacting. I introduced the term reflexively coupled. Reflex, as in one action causing an automatic reaction, means that if the cell acts on the environment, then the environment is changed, which then acts back on the cell. It's a continuous conversation, a continuous interaction. And in evolutionary terms, this means that evolution never occurs independent of the environment it's evolving in. It continuously interacts and changes that environment, which means we never have the perfect fitness landscape. We have evolution that changes the fitness landscape that then feeds back into evolution, which brings me back to the concept of ideal forms and perfection, which might be a particular solution at a point in time, but because of the reflexive nature of reality and the systems that operate within it, any near perfection that is achieved will slowly drift and become immaterial. Now, I'd like to start to abstract what we've been talking about into systems theory, and artificial intelligence and the training of language models has been one of the biomimicry engineering exercises that has proven very successful for reasons we still don't fully theoretically understand. The biological neuron has been mathematically modelled since the late 40s, 1950s, and the idea of building intelligent machines modelled on the neuron has been around since then, but the computing power and the models have needed until, let's say, the 2010s for the first real breakthroughs to occur. And now, in 2026, we are experiencing huge breakthroughs in terms of scaling and model evolution and design. And in later episodes, I plan to get into AI specifically in the context of human technology. But for the moment, what I want to do is consider a living organism as a model of reality that's exploring a fitness landscape through evolution and survival. That model can be very specific and brittle, which means that the organism is highly evolved for a specific niche, but not very flexible. The model can be broad and dynamic, which means it can adapt very quickly, but it might not be very specific. So we can think of it as an expert versus a jack of all trades. That's one of the trade-offs that these models can have. Another perspective on the models is that they model, and I'm using modeling a lot, in order for a living cell to survive and make decisions, it needs to learn different things about its environment. If this chemical gradient changes, how do I respond? If this environmental sensor receives this stimulus, how do I respond? And therefore, what we get is we get a series of stimulus response loops that are tested against survival. And the cell becomes our predictor of the future. If this happens, I need to react this way in order to improve my chances of survival. And one of the things we can say about life is that it works towards improving chances of survival above the background statistical odds by acting either structurally and chemically or behaviourally in the world. And from one perspective, this is the model predicting, and from another, it is simply the model reflecting its environment and how it has experienced it over the immediate history in terms of the current chemical concentrations, and the long-term history in terms of the evolved systems and structures. From an abstract perspective, these can be seen as simulations. There is a German word linked to some science that was specifically in biology simulating the environment, and the German word is Umwelt, which is simply German for environment, the world around us. And I will use that word whenever I refer to this concept. And so the single cell, even though it doesn't have a brain or any nerves or neurons that we know of, it only has the nanomolecular chemistry and the genetic memory machinery. It still generates a simulation, a reflection of its Umwelt, which it uses to make decisions, be they simple chemical genetic decisions or behavioural movement decisions. And these decisions alter its survival, and through that we have evolution selecting on cells that are more able to survive, mostly through luck, but over time more and more through their adaptations and structure to the environmental challenges to that survival. So the concept that I've been trying to develop is that the living cell, a living system, through evolution begins to build simulations of its environment, bounded by the limits of its architecture. So a living cell cannot perceive reality like we perceive it, but it does have an umvelt representation. It is a simulator. Here I want to introduce the concept that the map is not the territory. When we create maps, we create compressed representations of reality. A map is a geography that points out certain things such as contours, roads, features like cities or minerals. So the map is an abstraction. The abstraction is useful because it allows us to focus on certain aspects of that territory. And yesterday I used the concept of framing in order to bring certain parts of reality into focus and ignore others, and maps do the same. So when we use maps, we are using an abstraction. A map is a static object, and it's our use of the map that uses that static representation dynamically in a simulation. The same is said for the Umwelt, the living structure of the cell, including the dynamics of its chemistry and its information storage and retrieval in the DNA, RNA structures, And information is also stored structurally in the cell membranes, the receptors that the membrane expresses, all the internal structures. And I'm not a biological specialist, so I won't embarrass myself by going beyond my level of knowledge. That is another map of the territory. The map of the territory is the internal space that represents the outside world in the things that matter to the survival of a cell. And we'll be building on that theme extensively throughout this series. That's one of the philosophical points. The other thing that maps link to is framings and paradigms. So when we use a map, we are drawing out specific features of reality. We are not looking at reality. It can be tempting to think because we understand the map that we actually understand reality. And another key touch point in my own philosophical thinking is that reality is reality. Everything else is an abstraction. Everything we talk about, everything we think about, even our own internal mental representation of reality as we believe we understand it is never reality. The reality or the umwelt inside our minds is as much an abstraction as the umwelt within the single cell. We have our 5 senses that allow reality to enter our internal world. This is how our maps are created. The maps are constructed both through the learning of our minds and from the evolved structure of our physical selves. Both of these combine, much like the adaptation of the cell's dynamic chemistry and its evolved structure to represent its umwelt. This is another important concept, that our umwelt, our internal map of reality, is never reality itself. It's something to keep firmly in mind. We are a mirror reflecting an aspect of reality, limited by the biology and capability of ourselves. And so is everything, including the maps, including the models we create, including the mathematics we use and the artificial intelligence models we build. Everything is a reflection. There is a deeper philosophical side to things, which a lot of Eastern philosophy, which I will touch upon in my videos as well, including the philosophy of enlightenment. And one of those sayings is, don't speak of the moon, because to mention the moon is already too abstracted. You simply point at the moon, because the object is its own description, its own self. Okay, I think that's plenty for this morning. And so I'm trying with these series, at least these first episodes, to begin to build a framework around systems philosophy thinking. My own understanding has moved way beyond these simple concepts. So I'm trying to construct a pathway of understanding that will allow me to lead you into some of the more intricate and deeper insights. Even so, I find the insight that life is eternal from one perspective, the insight that the eternal flame has a lot to do with living systems, the insight that no matter how good the map or representation of reality, the only thing that we can use to represent reality is itself. That is the basis of empirical science. The theory may be fantastic, but the science and the measurements form the ultimate arbiter. And then the insight that nothing exists in isolation, that we have natural modularity, which I will also explore and define in the future, natural boundaries around cells, which form bounded systems. Like in computation, these can be considered bounded functions. However, the boundary is a useful framing, a useful map, but separating the system from its environment is never possible, because dynamically the environment changes the system and the system changes the environment. We have dynamic equilibrium, which is the process by which the system resists and adapts to changes in the environment, which is why the living cells that still surround me can be that original proto-cell and have adapted and changed itself and its environment. I think that's where we'll leave it to here as the sun rises on another beautiful morning.